G'day lovelies, I'm Kitty. It's been a big year here at Fairy Encounters. We've shared so many true stories of fairy sightings and encounters, and we have loads more to share with you in the coming year. It's tricky picking favourites, but Dan and I have compiled a collection of what we think are the most memorable fairy encounters from this year, just for you. So I hope you'll take a little time out for yourself now. Come and sit down next to me and enjoy these incredible true stories. Let's begin with some gentle encounters and weave our way into the darker, more sinister ones. A poor man from Jedberg was on his way to Hawick for the purpose of attending a market. As he was passing over the side of Rubislaw, he was suddenly alarmed by a frightful and unaccountable noise. The sound, as he supposed, proceeded from an immense number of female voices. Amidst howling and wailing were mixed shouts of mirth and jollity, but he could gather nothing articulate except the following words. "Oh, there's a bairn born, but there's nothing to put on it." The occasion of this elfish concert, it seemed, was the birth of a fairy child, at which the fairies, with the exception of 2 or 3 who were discomposed at having nothing to cover the little innocent with, were enjoying themselves with that joviality usually characteristic of such an event. The astonished rustic, finding himself amongst a host of invisible beings in a wild moorland place, and far from any human assistance, should assistance be required, full of the greatest consternation, immediately on hearing this expression again and again, "There's a bairn born, but nothing to put on it," stripped off his plaid and threw it on the ground. It was instantly snatched up by an invisible hand, and the wailings immediately ceased, but the shouts of mirth were continued with increased vigour. Being of opinion that what he had done had satisfied his invisible friends, he lost no time in making off and proceeded on his road to Hawick, musing on his singular adventure. There he purchased a sheep, which turned out a remarkably good bargain, and returned to Jedberg. He had no cause to regret his generosity in bestowing his plaid on the fairies, for every day afterwards his wealth multiplied, and he continued till the day of his death a rich and prosperous man. The year was 1977. Ned Grimm set out for a walk into some wooded land in New York State on an overcast day. Very soon after entering the trees, he experienced an inexplicable tingling sensation in his body. Understandably, this sudden change seized his attention and he stopped to look around, only to find the countryside around him looked different. There was also a strange green tinge in the sky, and it was no longer overcast. He walked a little and came upon some grey cliffs, which he knew should not have been there, and then he heard strange sounding music. On rounding a bend, he saw a small waterfall, where sat 4 little men playing pipes, while a 5th was collecting water in a jug from the waterfall. Grimm had the presence of mind to take a photo of the scene with his camera, at which point the little men disappeared. In a state of utter confusion, Grimm set off for his car and walked around for an hour or so searching for it. Then he saw his car through a cluster of trees, and the inexplicable tingling sensation rippled through his body again. He turned around to find that the strange country he had been walking through, with the clear, green-tinged sky, where he had seen the grey cliff, the waterfall and the 5 little men, and where he had heard their music, had vanished. It was gone. Grim thought he had been gone from his car for at least 3 hours, but his watch showed it had only been 30 minutes. As for the photograph Grim took of the 5 little men, when he took the film to be developed, he discovered that the photo of the little men was not developed. That is to say, it just didn't work. Photos taken before and after it on the roll had been developed, but not that photo. A Shetlander, who is probably still alive, affirmed that he was once taken into a hill by the Trows. Here, one of the first objects that met his view was one of his own cows that was brought in to furnish materials for a banquet. He regarded himself as being in rather a ticklish situation if it were not for the protection of the Trow women by whose favour he had been admitted within the hill. On returning home, he learned, to his great surprise, that at the very moment he saw the cow brought into the hill, others had seen her falling over the rocks to her death. A mile west of Curtin is a farm known as Bell Hole. At and near this farm, a phantom black dog is frequently seen, most often along the stretch of road leading to the town of Curtin. The black dog was believed to occupy a hole that is on the bank of a nearby stream, and the custom at the time was to keep the hole covered with sticks. If the black dog was seen, the hole would invariably be found open the following morning, then quickly covered up again by local folk. The black dog usually appeared along the road to Curtin at night, walking or sometimes running just out of arm's reach beside a single person. It could never be touched. But one day, a most extraordinary event occurred, and the farmer's wife at Bell Hole Farm got a very close look at this phantom black dog. It was evening, and the woman was alone in the cottage when, with no sound or warning, the black dog walked through the open door into her kitchen. It then proceeded to carefully walk around the kitchen before venturing further into the cottage. The woman stood still as a statue, knowing that this was no ordinary dog and did not dare to disturb it. It was clear this black dog wanted to explore her cottage, and she intended to let it. She never knew its reasoning or intent, but after several minutes, the dog returned to the kitchen and wandered back out the kitchen door. At no time did it approach or even acknowledge Mrs. Brown. There was a woman who lived alone in the townland of Raheen, County Galway. It was summertime, and she used to go out every evening to the field to milk her cow. One evening she saw a cat sitting on a wall near her, and when she was returning home from the field, the cat followed her to the house. Well, she took no notice of it. She just thought it belonged to one of the neighbours. But the next evening, the very same thing happened. And again on the third evening. And when she got back to the house, she gave the cat a saucer of milk. The cat drank all the milk, and when it had finished, the cat said to the woman, "It is a good thing you gave me milk this evening." And with that, the cat disappeared and was not seen again. In a parish in County Tipperary, there lived a family with 3 beautiful girls. These sisters were the admiration of everybody, but the youngest of the 3 exceeded the others in her beauty and charm of manners. The way to the Catholic Church from their home was a mass path which led by a very airy ford. Well, one Sunday, when the youngest sister was going to Mass, she met near the fort a tall, red-haired man who engaged her in conversation for some minutes. When at last she reached the chapel, Mass had just begun, and the less attentive or devout of the worshippers noticed that as she passed them by on her way through the crowded church, she looked very much upset. At the rising of the host, it was reported that she gave 3 screeches for the foxy man. She was taken out of the church by her father in a dazed condition and never again recovered her senses or her charm. But after some time, when she had partially recovered her strength, she used to spend a good part of each day in a paddock with a fierce bull. It was an everyday sight to see her scratching the bull's horn, with her arm thrown affectionately around his neck. No 3 men in the district would be willing to enter the field in which this bull was, so fierce was he, yet this girl had become its master. In this region of Cornwall, there are 2 kinds of pixies. One purely a land-dwelling pixie, and the other a pixie that dwells on the sea strand between high and low water mark. The land-dwelling pixie are usually thought to be full of reckless, mischievous fun, but they do no serious harm to anyone. It is known that they possess a green balm made from herbs gathered from Cerris Moor. Now, certain local people were favoured by the pixies, and on occasion the pixie folk would rub this green balm on their eyes, which allowed them to join the pixies in their revels. Those who were touched by this green balm told that while with the pixies, time slipped away very rapidly, but on returning, no time had passed at all. No other after effects of this green balm were ever reported. I was walking down a trail in the bush, and it was late at night. There was a heavy fog just above ground level. As I was going along, a redcap jumped out from the underbrush beside the trail and confronted me. He was a swarthy 3-foot little man with a large nose and an angry demeanour. His job was border patrol. I have no idea how I knew that, but it was his turn to watch the edge of their territory. Now, I feel that I must touch on something here, and that is that I am by no means an expert on lucid dreams or fairy or spiritual planes, but know that from other people's experiences, the good people can have great influence over our minds and emotions. But during this experience, the redcap had no influence over me. I simply picked him up, hugged him as he struggled, and set him down again. He was dumbfounded as to how I did that. I started to walk on, but he began chasing me, so I turned and looked at him and just projected a feeling of calm towards him. He stopped dead in his tracks, and he just stood there, completely complacent. Well, from there I continued through the fog and suddenly was in a forest community. It resembled a cross between an Ewok village and Lothlorien in Lord of the Rings. Elaborate homes made in tree trunks and up in the branches. The trees were huge, green and covered in moss all down the trunks. The folk were average human size, but they all had a slim build. They looked like elves, dressed in green, with a fair complexion and pointed ears. Parts of their clothes seemed to be made of foliage or leaves, but not entirely. They were very surprised to see me there. I mean, it was like watching a movie scene in which the people filled the streets to see the alien ship that had arrived. They stood with their mouths all hanging open and a look of shock on their faces. Except I was the alien ship. Well, I decided to move to one of the balconies above. I just thought it and it happened. After that, I was walking again, but I came out of the woods to a small grassy field which had a stream running through it, and it led to a large lake with mountains on the opposite side. I noticed a small girl hiding amongst the reeds and cattails at the mouth of the stream. Our eyes met, and I continued walking on towards the edge of the lake to look at the mountains. The next thing I knew, someone took my left hand. It was the girl, and she stood there with me for a few moments. She looked to be no more than 5 years old, but she was much older, although she was still considered fairly young by her people. She wore a large head covering for camouflage made of the reeds and long grasses. It was long enough to reach the back of her thighs. She was also caked in mud from her chest down and all down her arms. I couldn't tell if she even had some kind of bottom on because of the amount of mud on her. After a few moments, I turned to her, kissed her forehead, and said I had to go. She nodded and let go of my hand. I was 24 at the time and living in Anglesey. One night I was walking home at about 10:30 at night when there appeared just before me a very pretty young lady of ordinary size. I felt no fear at her sudden appearance, but stepped toward her and said, "How do you do?" And I put out my hand to shake hers. But my hand and my arm went right through her form. I couldn't understand this and just stood there, baffled. I reached out a few more times to touch her, but with the same result. There was no solid substance in the body, yet it remained beside me and was as beautiful a young lady as I ever saw. When I reached the door of the house where I was to stop, she was still with me. Then I said good night to her. No response being made, I asked, "Why do you not speak?" And at this, she disappeared. One day, some men were working on a road in the village of Lissyconnor. There was a hawthorn tree growing by the side of the road, and there was also a fort inside the fence. The foreman ordered the men to cut the hawthorn as it hung out over the road. They began to hack and cut at the tree, and when they had it half cut, a stranger approached the group of men and told them not to proceed any further with the work or they would be sorry. They did not stop cutting at the hawthorn tree, and a short while after, a man from the company came with a message for the foreman that his son was dying. It was only then that the foreman ordered the men to stop cutting at the hawthorn tree. He raced home to find that his son was quite well, and the hawthorn tree was never touched again from that day to this. There was a man who lived in the village of Cavetown in County Roscommon who was known as a great hunter. There was a little wood near his home, and he went fowling in this wood almost every night. Well, one night, this man was walking down a little road through the wood, and on crossing a bridge, he saw a white fairy woman stood before him. He stopped at once and decided to try and walk past her on one side, but found he was unable to pass her. He couldn't move forward. So he did the only thing he could and turned and made his way back home. He returned to the wood later that night and again found the white fairy woman was still standing at the edge of the bridge. Once again he turned and went home, having decided that this time he would return with his gun. Well, thankfully, he was talked out of this by his friends, and soon after the events of that night, the man went to America and lived a long, prosperous life. Now, many who knew the man believed that this was because he spared the life of the fairy woman. At the turn of the 19th century, there lived a man named Travers in Bridgetown, County Wexford. He had a horse, and one night he put her out in a field where he knew there to be a fairy ring. Well, it was believed that the fairies hunted this horse around the field all night because the next morning the horse came to the gate in a state of exhaustion. The sweat was running down off her. Travers' mind immediately turned to the fairy ring, and he suspected that he had made a mistake in leaving her in that field overnight. He sent for a man named Walters, who was known far and wide to be wise to the ways of the fairies. Walters told Travers to put down a post in the ground and tie the horse to it, and to leave the horse to go around the post from sunrise until sunset, and that this would set things right, as the horse could rest without being hounded or herded by the fairy. Travers did what he was told, but unfortunately the damage had been done. Just before noon that day, the horse collapsed and died. In a glen near Moville there once lived fairies. The principal amusement during the winter nights of these fairies was dancing and fiddling. One clear midsummer night, a goodly company of young men were gathered in a house for a night's amusement. The fiddler for the occasion was a noted favourite who always gave of his best on all occasions. After partaking of a hearty supper made up of homemade bread, butter and jam with sweet milk, the party was seated round a bright peat fire, cracking jokes or listening to tales of heroism told by the old couple of the house. Then, just at midnight, the faintest music was heard. So beautiful it was that the fiddler was visibly moved and thrown into an ecstasy. His eyes shone like brilliant stars. His body trembled while his hands clenched tightly on his beloved fiddle. All the company looked on and appeared to be greatly frightened at the appearance of this beloved fiddler. Not a word did he utter, but listened with rapt attention as the music drew nearer and sounded sweeter. All believed that it could not be produced by any mortal person. No one but the fairies could bring out such delightful notes on a violin. Suddenly the fiddler arose, his face all aglow, and he rushed to the door and out into the open night. All voices could be heard calling on the fiddler to stop, and still the music continued, although it grew fainter and fainter. The fiddler followed the fairy music. The people could hear the fairy music and the fiddler's voice calling out. By the light of the moon, people saw this fiddler climbing up a mountain until he was lost to view. That was the last sight they ever had of their beloved fiddler, as he was never seen or heard of again. The cobbler and his family took all the pranks in good part. When heavy steps were heard descending the stairs and a wisp of blue mist drifted across the room, the cobbler only said, Never mind old blue birches, he never do no harm. And he would proudly boast how blue birches ran across the room like a little blue pig and jumped into the duck pond without making a splash, and how when they were coming back late from market he would set the house all aglow to make them think it was on fire. But one day the cobbler told his tales to the wrong person, one of the church parsons, who took blue birches to be the devil himself, and soon brought along another church parson to banish this fairy. So it was, they came up and found an old white horse grazing by the duck pond. "Who's that?" the parson asked the little boy. "That be old blue birches, sir," said the boy. "Can you put a bridle on him?" asked the parson. The boy was proud to show the parson how friendly Blue Birches was and placed the bridle over his head. At once both the parsons said together, "Depart from me, you wicked!" Blue Birches plunged into the pond and never came out again, at least not in so friendly a form. My father told me a terrible tale of this old man from the town that he was born in. He said this man lived and died an unlucky man. So one night this man was making the short walk home from Kenmare. It was late, and being winter, the night was dark and the weather was very bad, but he had walked this road many, many times. Well, as he walked, he heard the sound of two dogs barking at each other, seemingly on either side of the road that he walked. Well, this captured his attention because that place was known as a lonesome place, a place frequented by the fairy folk. The dogs became increasingly agitated and angry, so the man hastened his step for to pass through the place as quickly as he could. Just then a heavy shower of rain began to fall, so he pushed his way into some heavy hedges for to keep out of the rain. Well, the dogs fell silent, and a moment later something which he described himself as the puka pushed its way into his shelter, saying, "Pull in, pull in, there is a she coming from the west, spitting out fire." Well, the man and the puka stayed there and listened as the she slowly approached and then past them. The old man later described the sound of the she as a billowing or a rolling sound. Once the she had passed, the puka creature darted from the hedge without a word, and the man never saw it again. But the poor man himself, he made his way home, took to his bed, and never left it. He died soon after without doctor or priest, but only his family by his side. Across the lake, opposite the hill, grows a hawthorn tree. In spring and summer it is just an ordinary hawthorn tree, but in autumn, when other trees are preparing for the year's rest and their leaves are turning brown and withering, and in winter when the other trees are bare and leafless, then this hawthorn tree is remarkable. Its leaves are still as green and plentiful as they were in the month of June. All the year round it preserves its leaves green and fresh, and the local people say it marks the burial place of fairy gold. On this account it is guarded by the fairies, and so must not be touched any more than trees that are growing in a fort. Several stories are told locally of the people who interfered with this tree and were punished for it. Those who did so unwittingly got such slight warnings as sore hands or legs caused by scratches from the tree, and these got all right again. But others who injured the tree through bravado were more seriously punished by broken limbs caused by falling on the way home, some of which resulted in permanent injuries. On the top of Slieve Golry there once was worked a great sand pit by the local peasantry, who made their living by quarrying sand and trading it to distant contractors who were at that time building provincial towns in the Midlands. Now, at the back of this sand pit, on the southwest side, there was a deep hole, or well. It was held sacred by the local people, and anyone who interfered with it in any way was supposed to meet with trouble. However, the sand pit was becoming exhausted, and year by year the quarrymen were working in the direction of the well. As time went on, the seam was being worked until the quarrying almost reached the well. One day, the sand in the face of the pit turned into yellow clay, and the men had to cease work. They left off, but commenced work on the southeast side of the quarry. Owing to the material being held up for some days, the men were obliged to work overtime, which meant working until nightfall. The first dusky evening that the men worked, they saw a blue light rising out of the well, and this made them very fearful. Some of the braver men amongst the crowd ventured to walk towards the well, but they were driven back instantly by a very strong, sickening smell of sulphur. At least, that's what they thought it was. The next day, the men began to work again and didn't leave the quarry until nightfall. This time, small pieces of sand and stones came out from the direction of the well. Little by little, the sand or stones became larger until finally the men were obliged to depart from the quarry altogether. They went back a distance of about 100 yards from the quarry and stood in conversation for some time, watching the showers of stones which were being belched from the well. As the evening went on, the stones became much larger until finally large boulders were being flung all around the quarry. This caused the men to debate among themselves the cause of such a remarkable happening, and they soon decided to go home. Some of the men called on a very old man on their way home and told him what had occurred. He told them that there was a fairy well on the top of Slieve Golry and asked the men in the name of God to close the well early next morning. Well, a small party of men went back to the quarry the next day to close it, and on arriving at the spot, what did they find but a big granite flag covering the well? This flag is still to be seen on the top of Slieve Golry. The men then, through fear, closed in the quarry and made it level with the rest of the mountain. And no one has ever dug for sand in that part of the mountain since. There was a man from our village coming over from England. As the boat was out in the middle of the sea, a storm arose. It was not long until the people saw a lovely girl coming into the boat. She beckoned to a boy that was in the boat to come out with her into the water. He was terrible afraid to go, but it was not long until the mermaid became agitated and she began to rock the boat back and forward over and again. Well, the captain was very angry when the boy would not go with her and feared for his boat and the safety of the other passengers, so he seized the boy and threw him into the sea. The mermaid took the boy with her and, to the horror of those on board, brought him under the water. He was never seen again. One summer's day, 4 men from Bruckless went out fishing. They knew the direction of the wind, and the sea was calm. Once out from shore, they heard the most beautiful singing, and looking in the direction of some rocks, saw a lovely girl sitting there, half girl, half fish, with long curly hair. Some said they should return to shore when they saw her, but others said it was wrong to believe in such things, so off they sailed. Well, the next day they were fishing 7 or 8 miles from land and heard the mermaid again, only not singing but crying. The sky grew very dark and cold. The fishermen became terribly frightened and turned at once for home. The wind began to blow, the sea became rough, and the boat hopped wildly upon the waves. When they came in sight of the rocks, the mermaid was sitting on the very same place, but the waves were hitting hard against the rocks, and she was crying bitterly with sorrow. They sailed in past the bar, and knew then that they were safe from danger, for looking behind them at the sea was a wall of water. If their boat had been only 2 minutes later, it would have been wrecked. There was once a large hawthorn in the townland of Killygally. It was there for many generations, and local people would not dare touch it. This hawthorn tree was a landmark which could be seen from many counties around, and was known as the Killygally Lone Bush. Now, it was the custom at that time to have a large May bush around which boys and girls danced. They usually vied with each other to see who would have the largest, hawthorn May bush being the kind always chosen. A number of young men from Carrickmacross, wishing to have the largest, came and cut off the main branch of the Killygally Lone Bush, pulled it with ropes into Carrickmacross, and erected it close to the old church. However, these young men had no chance for dancing and merrymaking around the bush, as many of them broke arms and legs while taking it into town. Then during the following year, many sudden deaths occurred among those who had taken part in the cutting of that hawthorn tree. Old people in the district begged them to take back what remained of the branch, as sad and pitying sounds could be heard around the remains of the old cut bush. But sadly, the courage of the young men failed them, and today nothing remains of the once famous Killygally Lone Bush. There lived in the townland of Rockbrook a farmer, his wife, 1 son and 3 daughters. The father of the house didn't believe that fairies existed. He was a very rich man and was well known by many people. Now there was a fort on his farm which was convenient to his house, and part of it remains to the present day. Now he always had it on his mind to remove this fort, but his wife always opposed the idea. However, he intended to remove it, and one day he could not be persuaded. So he commenced the work of removing the fort, and in the evening of that day, around dusk, there came into the farmer's house a small but well-dressed woman. The farmer's wife was alone in the house when the stranger entered, and she asked the farmer's wife for the loan of some meal. The woman of the house gladly gave her the meal. The stranger was very grateful for the meal and told the farmer's wife she would return with it in 3 days. But it was not altogether the meal that brought me, she went on to say, but I want you to give a message to your husband. You must tell him to stop destroying that fort. Well, the farmer's wife told her husband exactly what had happened, but it was all in vain. Nothing could prevent him. The third day came, and the stranger returned with the loan, and the farmer's wife was again all alone in that house. The stranger said she came to give back the loan that she obtained a few days previously. "It seems," she said, "that you could not prevent your husband from destroying our house. Your husband is going to bring a great misfortune on himself and his family." "I am sorry, I cannot prevent him," the woman said. "I am one of the good people, but it seems my warning to you was in vain." She bade the woman goodbye and passed out of the house. But days after this, a great fever struck the family, and they all died, because this man would not grant the request sought by the woman from the fairy fort. A long time ago there was an old fairy, often seen in a field where stood a large stone we called Lockmore. The fairy looked similar to a woman, having long hair flowing down its back and a white garment down to its toes. But it was painfully tall, not what you could ever call a woman. Not everyone could see her, only some, and it was believed that she had a connection to that standing stone, that she felt she owned it or was responsible for it. Others thought she lived under it or hid something under it. Well, regardless, no person would ever go too close to that stone. Sometimes people who couldn't see her would take their dog to the field because it was believed the dogs could see her. You see, they would stand rigid, just barking at the stone and the area around the stone, darting their eyes about and barking till their throats were raw. Then, as quickly as they had started, the dogs would cease their barking, turn, and run home. When she was younger, my mother, Mrs. McKenna, lived in County Offaly. She had a younger sister who was dying, and one night the family was sitting all around the fire in great sadness. My mother was unmarried at the time, and her sister, who lay dying, was only 18 years old. As the family sat quietly around the fire, they heard a car pass by, and then immediately afterwards they heard the most awful screams. They all jumped up and opened the door and looked out, thinking that a child or someone had fallen out of the car. Her brother, Johnny, went out onto the road to check, but the car had gone and the screaming had ceased. After taking a considerable length of time to look around for a possibly injured person, Johnny eventually returned to the house and shut the door behind him. Immediately the crying and wailing and screaming started up again, but this time it was noticeably closer to the house. So Johnny went out again, and again the crying stopped. The same thing happened a third time, and after that the cry began to circle around the house, getting louder and more awful, and it was then that they realised that it was the Banshee. No one was brave enough to approach the door, let alone open it to look out. The crying continued during the night, with constant crying followed by a short interval, then crying again. As morning approached, the family was still sitting around the fire, and they noticed that the crying was becoming quieter, weaker and farther away, until finally it ceased altogether. That day, my mother's sister died. The Banshee is supposed to follow a family named Bradley who live in a place called Clonee, which is only a mile from where I live. One night, a man named John O'Hara was on his way home and he had to pass by Clonee. When he was coming near the Bradleys' house, he saw the Banshee sitting on a low branch of a tree, just combing her hair. He slowed as he approached her and said, "Good night," but she would not speak. He said, "Good night," but again she looked at him without answering. Well, this angered him, and at last he said, "Whoever you are, I will make you speak." And he hurried home to get his dog. When he came to where the Banshee was, the dog, which was known to be fierce, would not go anywhere near her. So he went home with the dog, got his gun, loaded it up, and put a bent sixpence in it. He returned to the tree where she had been sitting, but she was gone. Only 2 days later, one of the Bradleys died in their home, and the night before the death, the keening of the Banshee could be heard all over the countryside. People truly believed that something terrible was going to happen to John O'Hara because of how he behaved to the Banshee, but nothing ever did. He's still hale and hearty, and it is some years now since he heard the Banshee. A strange story is told about a little boy who was stolen from his parents by the good people, as the fairies are sometimes called. In his place was left a shriveled-looking, cross-tempered boy with an enormous appetite. The heartbroken parents did not suspect the trick the fairies had played on them. They thought that the change in their son was due to an illness, which left him a helpless invalid. The poor mother got into blame one day for giving the invalid all the food in the house. Their other son, enraged and ashamed to have no food for the men whom he had threshing the corn, rushed into the room with a loaded gun in his hands and shouted at the crippled baby, "Clear out, or I will shoot you." To the astonishment of all, the boy jumped out of bed and begged for mercy and cried, "I'll go tonight! I'll go tonight!" They thought the lad had gone crazy, but at midnight that same night, such terrifying shrieks and sounds came from the room that their hearts nearly stopped beating. At last they had courage enough to enter the room, and they found calmly sleeping in bed not the withered-looking invalid, but their own child, strong and healthy as he ever was. There was a woman rowing a boat on Hawthorn Lake. A man was standing on the bank, and he saw the head of a horse appearing over the water. This monster looked directly at the man, and the man shouted at the woman to row quickly out of the lake. She looked back and saw this monster, but he had seen her first and was following her. She managed to land on the shore first, and the lake horse disappeared again below the water. There is a well-authenticated tradition of a race of beings who, in the middle of the 16th century, inhabited the great dark wood in Merionethshire, and who were called the Red Fairies. They lived in dens in the ground, had fiery red hair and long, strong arms, and it was known that they would steal sheep and cattle by night. There are cottages near the great dark wood with scythes in the chimneys, which were put there to keep these terrible beings out. One Christmas Eve, a knight named Baron Owen headed a company of warriors who violently assailed the Red Fairies and found them to be flesh and blood. The Baron hung 100 of them, but spared the women, one of whom begged hard for the life of her son. The Baron refused her prayer, whereupon she opened her breast and shrieked, "This breast has nursed other sons than he, who will yet wash their hands in thy blood." Baron Owen. Not very long thereafter, the Baron was waylaid at a certain spot by the sons of the fairy woman and delivered her promise. Her sons washed their hands in his warm and reeking blood in fulfilment of their mother's threat, and to this day that spot goes by the name of the Baron's Gate. There was a big, queer animal seen around here not so long ago. It was a strange thing, as big as a donkey, but it had the shape of a dog, and it was always seen by the villagers of Ballinastack whenever there had been a death in the village. It was believed that this creature lived with, or at least near, a particular woman that lived in the village. This woman was well known in the village, as it was believed that she had been with the fairies, that is to say, to have lived with the fairies for 7 whole years. So familiar was the woman with this dog-like creature that she named it Charlie. Local folk noticed that if this woman told too much about her time with the fairies, she would be black and blue in the morning, with Charlie having beat her. Well, this animal she called Charlie could transform itself into anything it liked, and if this woman that was with the fairies went to visit the neighbour's house and stayed too long, she would say, "I must go home now, Charlie is pinching me." When she eventually passed away, this huge creature never visited the town again. There was a man in this district who used to only go home from work once each week. And so it was, one Saturday night, in the cold month of November, he went home very late at night. When he arrived at his home, he found, to his bitter grief, that his wife was very ill. Well, he didn't go to work the next week, but stayed at home and nursed his wife. One night, after he'd gone to bed, he heard someone moving outside his window. He went outside to look, but found nobody there. No sooner had he come in when he heard someone moving outside his window again. Just as he was going out the door to look, he heard 3 frightful yells. He didn't turn back, however, and was just in time to catch sight of a woman clad in white garments with very long hair. The woman was, of course, the Banshee. The man followed her for about 1/4 mile until the Banshee dropped her comb. He grabbed it and ran off back home as fast as his legs would carry him. When he reached his home, he went to his bed and put the comb under his pillow. No sooner had he climbed into the bed when the Banshee came to the window. The man was terrified and threw the comb out of the window. The Banshee disappeared. When the Banshee was gone, he went to his wife's room to see how she was, and he found, to his terrible grief, that she was dead. We were having a great time. It was beautiful. After we had a long walk and some food, we went into our tents. Keith had 2 dogs with him in his tent, and I was alone in mine. It was about 11:30 p.m. when I started to hear footsteps outside. Now remember, there was only us in the area, so I called out to Keith to ask him what was that. Was that him walking around outside? And Keith replied, "No. Why? What is it?" I said, "I hear footsteps outside." And he called out, "Just go to sleep." Well, a few moments later, I heard them again, so I called Keith again and said, "Okay, what's going on?" He said, I know, now I hear them too. Well, soon after, the side of the tent lit up, was the right side. Not much, just a bit lighter where I could see images. First, it was a tiny person with really spiky hair walking past my side of the tent. Then it did it again, but its hair changed from spiky hair to like a Robin Hood-shaped hat. Then, this is what really got me, it showed me a hand, but with really long fingers wriggling at the side of the tent. And I mean really long fingers. Then Keith shouted at me that he could hear sniffing and grunting at his tent. Now, we don't have wild pigs here in Ireland, so we both jumped up and went out of the tent to look, only to find nothing at all. Now, I did not believe in fairies, but this whole experience went on from 11:30 till about 7:30 a.m. We didn't get one bit of rest. And the last part of this terrifying experience was about 6:30 to 7:15 a.m. when this scary, wild wind came up from nowhere and continued for about 20 minutes, till eventually we both just said, enough is enough. We packed up and left for home. So when I got home, I looked up the history of Glenmalure, and there were some battles that happened there a long time ago with the British back in the day, but I also found that there is a lot of activity with fairies there. So I looked up that too and found out that what we had seen was a higher fairy with the spiky hair and the very long fingers. I was in shock. So was Keith. I tell you, I have never, ever had anything like this happen to me before. Was there a reason for this? Did we camp on their land? Or did we block their path? Or were we too loud? I really don't know, but it terrified both of us. In October 1943, just as I reached the summit cairn of Ben Macdui, mist swirled across and enveloped the mountain. The atmosphere became dark and oppressive. A fierce, bitter wind whisked among the boulders, and an odd sound echoed through the mist. A loud footstep, it seemed. Then another, and another. Well, I am not an unduly imaginative man, but my thoughts flew instantly to the grey man. Then I felt the reassuring weight of the loaded revolver in my pocket. Grasping the butt, I peered about in the mist tattered by the eddies of wind. A strange shape loomed up, then receded, and then came charging at me. Well, without hesitation, I whipped out the revolver and fired 3 times at the figure. When it still came on, I turned and headed down the path, reaching Glenderry in a time that I have never bettered. You may ask, was it really the big grey man? Frankly, I think it was. A man named McKenny and his family lived along Berlurgan Road. Well, one day the man and wife went to town, leaving the children to look after the house. All went well till evening, and there was no sign of their return. As darkness fell, the children became anxious, and after a time they heard the alarming noise of a pack of hounds approaching the house. Now there was a pane missing from the back window of the house, and the children were surprised and terrified to see a man grasp the side of the window and push his head in. The children watched as the man was seized from behind by several forms outside and dragged back. Still, he tried to escape their clutches, and this time managed to get one of his shoulders in, but the pull from behind became greater, and he was again dragged out. This time he was surrounded and carried off roaring for all that was in his power. Next morning, it was found that the man of the house was drowned in the Black Ford when returning from town, and it was commonly believed that he had been captured by the fairies and was trying to escape when the forms appeared at the window. It was thought that if any person were to have caught his arm, he probably would have escaped the fairies. I just love sharing these stories and bringing them to life for you. And if you enjoy my weekly videos and would like to support my channel, please consider becoming my patron. I adore my gorgeous patrons and they help make this channel possible. Sending love and thanks to my treasured patrons for their support this year. To Brian, Janice, Serafina, Kristen, Pandora, Donna, Bruna and Kimber Blue. Until next time, stay curious and be kind. Cheerio!